The Forge by Landsec, a pair of offices that went to experimental lengths to change the way we think about construction. In the process, it became the first development to meet the UK Green Building Council's definition of net zero. To meet those rigorous targets, Landsec had to rethink construction from the ground up. We're in London to find out how they did that. Landsec's Neil Pennell showed us around, and what we saw was a site that looked deceptively conventional for London. But behind the veneer of normality was striking innovation. These two buildings weren't just constructed, they were manufactured.
We've taken learnings from the manufacturing sector and embedded it into the process used to construct the forge. And that process is known as a design for manufacture and assembly process. And another step beyond that, we've tried to create a solution and a kit of parts that works with that approach that can be used repeatedly in the future, and hence is why it's called a platform design for manufacture and assembly approach.
In other words, most bits of the forge are standardized and assembled on site like an IKEA flat pack. Instead of material, they're building with components. Components that can later be reused. Temporary works, also reusable of course, propped up the floor slabs during construction. So the forge didn't need the usual permanent steel work you see in buildings on most of its floors. Services, the pipes and metal you see in the ceiling, came in cassette form and were slotted in.
The idea of having a platform is you design it once and everybody can use it, and you create a digital library of the components that people can go into and they can use those components to make their buildings. The concept is analogous to like Lego, or in that you create these building blocks and you can create anything out of the building blocks.
All this meant less waste, less space taken up by redundant steelwork, speedier construction, and thanks to the temporary works propping up the slabs, Landsec could use more environmentally friendly concrete that takes longer to cure. About 80% of the building was built this way. One place it didn't use it was the ground floor.
And the reason this floor hasn't used new innovation is because it's double height space, and the temporary works that we would have needed for the system that we've used to build the other floors, we'd have had to have another set of those just to do this one level.
Having two buildings on site was also an opportunity for Landsec to prove that it can use this method over and over again, and that it works. The forge has also made a point of being operationally green. Having scrapped the gas boilers in its original plans, Landsec opted for air source heat pumps and solar panels. The lack of boilers also means the basement was shrunk by 70%, meaning a massive reduction in carbon that otherwise would have been emitted from its construction. But it hasn't been a totally smooth ride. This was the first time anyone's taken this platform kit of parts approach in a commercial building.
There was a view that a good rate to achieve on a floor would be put 7 panels in a day. What we actually found when we had additional panels on site and there was a clear run for the installers, they were able to install 15 to 20 panels a day. So 2 to 3 times the number. So in theory you could have done it in at least half the time, maybe less. But the logistics had all been scaled to deliver to site from the factory 7 panels a day, because that was thought to be what the production rate would be. There was no data to tell anybody any different. They said, well, that's a good rate, let's assume you'll achieve it with this new way of working. And actually what we found was that it could be accelerated and done faster, but we couldn't accelerate the logistics back up to match that. But the data is what's really important, because now we've got data, and so we can explain to people that there's an opportunity here. We can see that this is the rate that you can install that particular component. But what you then need to make sure is you can get the components from the factory to the site, across the site, up to the floor, through the hoist, onto the floor to the position, the preparation process teams before it gets fitted. You need to make sure that all those workflows align to enable that final end process to be met in the timescale that's the best that it can do.
As an experiment, the forge did have one advantage. Landsec decided to go down the platform route midway through development. They already had a design for the site using traditional methods. So when they made the switch to their new techniques, they could compare the outcomes not just to a typical building, but a near identical one. Here's what the forge has achieved and expects to achieve once it's finished. An 18% reduction in steel, 13% reduction in concrete, a 25% reduction in embodied carbon, and a 5-star neighbors rating for environmental performance. Because of the pandemic leading to delays, some of the logistical issues Neil mentioned, and the fact that this was all brand new to everyone, cost savings were harder to pinpoint. But he did say the team delivered the forge in line with the costs you would expect in a traditional building.
This is still an exception, and when you have done this a number of times, the real savings will start to become apparent.
So how do you measure success in a building that's an experiment and whose costs were affected by uncontrollable circumstances? For Neil, it's a question of the forge's long-term influence.
It's been a long dialogue about the industry modernising itself, becoming more productive, becoming more attractive to a more inclusive workforce. If that interest converts into other people experimenting and trying to build on what we've done at the forge, then I think we'll have been successful in lighting the blue touch paper, if you like, for the industry to move up to a different level going forward. And it's a level we must strive for. We only have one planet, we only have one set of resources, we have to maximise that going forward.
What happens next will depend on the industry. Whether someone will take Landsec's example and plug it into new developments, add their own ideas, and push construction to new heights of efficiency and sustainability. For more on the forge and other buildings that push the envelope, go to placetech.net and subscribe for free.